The neon sign flickered above the glass door, humming faintly against the darkness of a sleepless city. Millie's Diner had stood on the corner for nearly 4 decades, a relic of a simpler time when truckers, night shift workers, and lonely drifters could always count on coffee that never ran dry and a jukebox that whispered old songs in the background. Inside, the air smelled of fried bacon, strong coffee, and the faint trace of bleach the night staff had used hours earlier. A waitress in her late 50s, apron tied loose around her waist, wiped down the counter with slow, practiced motions. It was past midnight, and the place was almost empty, save for a couple of college kids in the corner booth and a tired truck driver nursing his 3rd refill of black coffee. The bell above the door jingled softly. Heads turned briefly, then returned to their meals. A tall, broad-shouldered man stepped in. His clothes were worn, his boots scuffed from miles of walking. A long, heavy coat hung over him like armor, its collar pulled high as though to shield him from the chill of the night, or perhaps the world itself. He carried no suitcase, no belongings, no trace of where he had come from. But his posture gave him away, straight-backed, disciplined, as though the weight of years and hardship had not stripped him of the training that once defined him. His eyes scanned the room, not nervously, not timidly, but with the quiet, measured precision of someone who had learned to notice exits, faces, and shadows without drawing attention to himself. The waitress caught his gaze and offered a tired but kind smile. "Coffee?" she asked. The man nodded once, his voice low and rough. "Black." He slid into a booth near the window, where the glow of the neon sign washed over him in broken flashes of red and blue. He set his hands on the table, calloused and scarred, the kind of hands that had once held rifles, carried comrades, and endured winters colder than this diner could ever be. When the coffee arrived, he lifted the mug slowly, breathing in the steam before taking his first sip. It was hot, bitter, grounding. For a moment, his shoulders eased. For a moment, the world was quiet. The college kids in the corner whispered, half glancing at him, their curiosity piqued by the stranger's heavy presence. The truck driver barely looked up. He'd seen men like this before, men carrying stories behind their silence. No one in that diner knew his name. No one knew that he had once worn the uniform of the United States military, that he had fought battles on foreign soil, that he had seen friends fall beside him while he kept pushing forward. They didn't know that when he returned, medals on his chest, promises of honor in his ears, the world had turned its back on him. Homeless. Forgotten. Left to wander. And yet, in that moment, he wasn't a statistic. He wasn't a headline. He was just a man who wanted coffee in peace, a booth to rest his tired legs, and the small dignity of being treated like everyone else. The waitress brought a plate of scrambled eggs and toast without him ordering. "On the house," she said gently, her eyes holding a kindness too rare in his life. He looked at the plate, then at her, nodding once. Words of gratitude were not easy for him, years of silence had made his tongue heavy, but his eyes spoke enough. She patted the counter and walked away, leaving him to his meal. Outside, the street was quiet, the hum of distant traffic mixing with the occasional bark of a stray dog. The neon buzzed. Inside, the veteran cut his toast carefully, chewing slowly, savoring every bite as though it might be his last meal for the day. It was a fragile moment of peace. A fragile night where he could almost pretend he belonged. But peace, for men like him, rarely lasted. Because within minutes, the sound of tires screeching outside shattered the stillness. Red and blue lights painted the window, brighter, harsher than the soft neon glow. The low murmur of the diner quieted. The truck driver stiffened. The waitress froze, her rag mid-wipe. The door swung open hard, the bell clanging like an alarm. Two uniformed police officers stepped in, their boots heavy against the linoleum floor. Their laughter died when their eyes fell on him, the stranger in the corner booth, the man who looked out of place in their small slice of order. And just like that, the veteran's meal became the prelude to a storm. The diner's hum of quiet conversation died the instant the two officers stepped through the door. Their entrance wasn't subtle, it never was. They moved with the swagger of men who believed the uniform gave them more than authority, it gave them ownership of every space they walked into. The first was tall, lean, his jawline sharp, his haircut regulation tight. Officer Blake. His partner, Officer Daniels, was heavier set, a man who carried his belly like a badge of indulgence. Both wore the kind of smirk that didn't need a reason, the smirk of men who enjoyed being feared. The red and blue glow from their cruiser still bled through the diner windows, washing the veteran's booth in harsh light. The neon sign's gentle flicker suddenly seemed weak compared to the strobes outside. "Evenin', folks," Blake said, his voice carrying too loud, too deliberate. He wasn't greeting anyone. He was announcing his presence. The truck driver lowered his eyes to his mug. The college kids hunched over their fries, whispering nervously. The waitress, Millie, forced a smile, though the rag in her hand twisted tight. She'd seen this routine before. The uniforms changed, but the game never did. Then Blake's eyes landed on the man in the corner booth. The veteran didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't even look up from his plate. He carved another bite of scrambled eggs, slow and steady, as though the arrival of trouble was no different than the ticking of the clock above the counter. But to men like Blake and Daniels, silence was an invitation. "Well, well," Daniels muttered, his voice dripping with mockery. "What do we have here? Didn't know this place started serving strays." Blake chuckled, stepping closer. "Or maybe ghosts. Man looks like he crawled out of a grave and found his way to a diner." Millie spoke up quickly, trying to head off what she knew was coming. "He's a paying customer, boys. Leave him be. He's not causing trouble." Blake turned his head, his smirk widening. "Didn't ask you, Millie. We'll decide what's trouble." The veteran lifted his mug, took a sip of coffee, and set it down with precision. His hands didn't shake. His eyes stayed lowered, fixed on the dark liquid swirling inside the cup. But his silence wasn't submission. It was calculation. "Hey," Daniels barked, leaning on the edge of the booth. "You deaf, old man? You hear us talking to you?" Finally, the veteran looked up. His eyes, dark and steady, met Daniels's without a word. For a split second, Daniels faltered. There was something in that stare, not fear, not defiance, but the cold stillness of a man who had seen worse than any badge-wielding bully could offer. It unsettled him. But only for a second. "You think you're tough?" Blake sneered, filling the silence. "Sittin' here like you own the place. Bet you don't even have a place. Bet you're just another homeless leech livin' off scraps." The veteran's jaw tightened. He set his fork down, slow and deliberate, the faintest scrape of metal against porcelain cutting through the tense air. "Enough," Millie said firmly, stepping between them. Her voice cracked but held its ground. "You've got no reason to harass him. He hasn't done a thing." Blake's smile turned sharp. "Funny thing, Millie. You don't make the rules around here. We do." Daniels leaned closer to the veteran, the sour stench of coffee and cigarettes on his breath. "So what's your story, huh? Run out of park benches? Decide you'd stink up a booth instead? Still, the man didn't answer. He simply held Danielle's gaze, unblinking, unbroken. The silence stretched so long it became louder than words. Blake slapped the table hard, the dishes rattling. The college kids jumped in their seats. The truck driver muttered under his breath but didn't move. "You think you're better than us?" Blake hissed. "Sit there all calm, like you're untouchable. You ain't nothing. Nobody." The veteran's eyes flicked toward the window, toward the flashing lights outside. Not in fear. Not in surrender. In calculation. His hand slid slowly into the pocket of his coat. Daniels tensed. "What the hell you reaching for, old man?" Millie raised her hands. "Stop. He's not armed. He hasn't done anything." But the officers leaned in closer, ready to pounce. The diner held its breath. The veteran's hand emerged, not with a weapon, but with a battered cell phone. Its screen was cracked, the casing worn. He set it gently on the table, his thumb hovering over a number already pulled up. And for the first time, he spoke. His voice was low, gravelly, but steady as stone. "One call." The words cut through the tension like a blade. Simple. Final. Blake blinked, thrown off. Daniel scoffed, but his laugh lacked conviction. "What, you gonna call your social worker? Tell her we're being mean to you?" The veteran didn't answer. He didn't need to. He just tapped the phone once, as if reminding them of its weight. As if daring them to find out who was on the other end. Blake shifted uncomfortably, the smirk faltering. Danielle's jaw worked, trying to reclaim control of the moment. But the balance had already shifted. The diner remained silent, all eyes on the man who had said almost nothing, and yet spoken volumes. The trouble had arrived. But for the first time, the cops weren't sure who it was for. The silence in Millie's diner was heavier than smoke. Every set of eyes, from the truck driver's bloodshot stare to the nervous glances of the college kids, clung to the booth by the window, where a homeless veteran sat steady as stone, a cracked phone resting in his hand. The phone itself wasn't much. Its casing was chipped, its screen fractured. But the way the veteran placed it on the table, the way his thumb lingered over the number as if it were a trigger, shifted the air in the room. It wasn't just a phone anymore. It was a loaded weapon, not of bullets, but of consequences. Officer Blake leaned over the table, his jaw tightening, his smile sharpening into something meaner. He hated silence. He hated the way this man refused to flinch. Men like Blake fed on submission, on fear, on begging. But this stranger gave him none of it. "You think that little phone makes you important?" Blake sneered. "Newsflash, old man, out here, we decide what's important. You're just another bum trying to play tough." The veteran didn't blink. His eyes, dark and unreadable, locked on Blake's with the quiet intensity of someone who had measured enemies before and found them unworthy. Daniels chuckled, though the sound was more forced than amused. He tapped the veteran's mug with a thick finger, sloshing coffee onto the table. "Man's got nerves, I'll give him that. Probably been sleeping under bridges so long, he forgot what real fear feels like." The truck driver shifted in his seat, muttering, "Ain't right," under his breath. Millie shot him a warning look. She knew better. People who stood up to cops in her diner usually regretted it. Blake grabbed the edge of the veteran's plate, dragging it away from him. Scrambled eggs smeared across the formica table. Toast landed face down on the floor. Oops, Blake said with mock sweetness. Guess dinner's over. The veteran's jaw flexed once, but he didn't reach for the food. His hand stayed on the phone. That one word he'd spoken, one call, still lingered in the room like a ghost. Millie stepped forward, her voice trembling but firm. That's enough. He hasn't done a damn thing to you. Leave him be. Blake turned his head slowly, his smile curling into something darker. Careful, Millie. Don't forget who keeps this place safe. Who looks the other way when your dishwasher's green card expires, or when you pour whiskey into those coffee mugs for your favorite truckers. Millie froze, her lips parting, her face draining of color. The officers knew her secrets. That was the game, they always did. Satisfied, Blake turned back to the veteran. Now, let's see some ID. You got ID, huh? Or you too broke to carry a wallet? The veteran didn't move. Daniels grinned wide, enjoying the cruelty. He leaned closer until his bulk nearly shadowed the table. What's the matter, old soldier? Lose your dog tags along the way? Bet you did. Bet you lost a lot more than that. The veteran's eyes flickered, just for a heartbeat. Daniels saw it. And he pressed harder. Yeah, I know that look, Daniels said, his grin widening. You've seen things. Done things. Maybe you don't sleep much, huh? Maybe the only thing louder than the streets are the screams in your head. The college kids shifted uncomfortably in their booth. One of them, a girl with short hair and trembling hands, whispered, "Why don't they just leave him alone?" Her friend shook his head quickly, eyes darting toward the cops, silently pleading for her to stay quiet. The veteran breathed once, deep and controlled, as though steadying the storm that wanted to rise. His thumb pressed lightly against the phone screen, not dialing, not yet, just reminding them it was there. Blake's smirk cracked for the first time. The longer this man stayed calm, the more it unsettled him. It was supposed to be easy, bark orders, watch a nobody crumble, feel like a king. But this? This was different. So Blake changed tactics. He reached down and grabbed the veteran's coat collar, yanking it hard. Stand up, he snapped. The veteran didn't resist, didn't rise. His body stayed rooted in the booth, immovable. His voice, when it finally came, was low and steady, a voice that cut deeper because it carried no fear. Last warning. The words chilled more than they threatened. They weren't loud. They weren't theatrical. They were a soldier's words, the kind you hear once before things turn irreversible. Danielle's smirk faltered. Blake, red-faced, doubled down. Or what? You think somebody cares enough to pick up that call? You're nothing. You're nobody. Nobody's coming to save you. The veteran's lips barely moved, but his answer was clear. They already did. Blake blinked, confused. Daniels frowned, glancing at the phone. For the first time, doubt crept into their swagger. Who exactly did this man know? The veteran didn't explain. He didn't need to. His calm was explanation enough. Millie whispered under her breath, almost like a prayer, "Please, just walk away. Please." But the cops weren't ready to walk away. Bullies rarely did, not until they were forced. And the veteran, sitting silent and unshaken, had just shifted the rules of their game. The harassment had begun. But it was only the beginning of a war they never saw coming. The diner's air had thickened, heavy as smoke before a fire. Every eye in the room, the trucker, the college kids, Millie behind the counter, waited for the explosion. They had seen scenes like this before, cops pushing, people breaking, nights ending in cuffs or worse. But this time was different. This time, the man in the corner booth refused to play his role. The veteran sat unmoved, his body rooted to the vinyl seat like it had been carved into the diner itself. His plate of eggs lay overturned, coffee still dripping onto the table, Blake's hand still clenched on his collar. But the veteran did not flinch. He did not curse. He did not plead. He stared straight ahead, his silence filling the room. It wasn't the silence of fear. It wasn't the silence of defeat. It was heavier, colder, the silence of someone who had lived through storms far darker than the barking of two small-town cops. Blake tugged on his collar again, harder this time. "I said stand up." The veteran didn't move. His body remained still, immovable. His eyes, dark and steady, never left Blake's face. That stare, quiet, unbroken, began to do something no shouted insult or raised fist ever could. It unsettled. It exposed. Daniels shifted uneasily. "Man's just sittin' there like a statue." Blake's jaw tightened. He was used to compliance. He was used to fear. But silence? Silence was resistance he couldn't control. The veteran finally blinked, slow and deliberate, like a man deciding whether to speak or to remain in the fortress of his quiet. When his voice came, it was low, gravelly, like stones shifting under pressure. "You don't scare me." The words weren't shouted. They weren't even sharp. But in their calmness, they carried a weight that hit harder than anger ever could. Blake's hand faltered for a fraction of a second. Daniels frowned, his smirk weakening. The college kids in the booth leaned closer, breathless. Even Millie froze, her rag dangling from her hand. The veteran's eyes drifted down to the phone on the table. His thumb tapped it once, the screen glowing faintly. He didn't lift it. He didn't explain. He just let its presence linger like an unspoken threat. "One call," he repeated softly. The silence after was deafening. Blake forced a laugh, too loud, too brittle. "Yeah. And who you callin', huh? Ghostbusters? You think anybody cares what happens to you? You're a bum. A nothing." The veteran's gaze sharpened, cutting through Blake's mockery. Then, nothing. No reply. Just silence. That silence crawled under Blake's skin. It made the space between words unbearable. It forced him to keep talking, to fill the void, to prove he was still in control. "I asked you a question." Blake barked. Still silence. Daniels slammed a hand on the table, making the phone rattle. "Answer him." The veteran didn't blink. Didn't flinch. His breathing was slow, measured, the kind of breathing men are taught in foxholes, when panic means death and patience means survival. Millie finally spoke, her voice cutting through the tension like a blade. "He doesn't owe you a damn word." Both cops turned on her, eyes blazing. But she stood tall, shoulders squared, though her hands trembled. The trucker muttered again, louder this time, "Man ain't done nothin'. Leave him be." For the first time that night, the tide shifted. The silence wasn't just the veterans anymore. It had spread, rippling through the diner, turning the weight of stillness into quiet solidarity. Blake felt it. Daniels felt it. And neither of them liked it. "You think this makes you strong?" Blake hissed at the veteran, leaning closer, his nose inches away. You think sittin' there, starin', not talkin', makes you tough? The veteran's lips parted, barely. His voice was no louder than a whisper, yet it carried across the diner with the clarity of a gunshot. I've buried stronger men than you. The words hung in the air like smoke after a blast. They weren't a threat. They weren't boastful. They were a statement of fact, delivered with the weight of memory. Blake froze. Daniels blinked. The veteran's silence closed back in around them, stronger now, heavier, suffocating. The diner itself seemed to lean into that stillness. The hum of the fridge, the tick of the clock, the sizzle from the kitchen, all of it seemed to bow beneath the gravity of the moment. And in that silence, something shifted. For the first time since they entered, the cops looked less like predators and more like prey. Their uniforms couldn't shield them from the truth reflected in the veteran's eyes. They were boys playing at power, standing in front of a man who had lived through real war. The diner had become a battlefield without bullets. Blake and Daniel stood over the booth, puffed up with authority, their voices louder than they needed to be. Millie froze behind the counter, her knuckles white around the rag. The trucker watched with a frown, too worn down by life to intervene, but too human to look away. The two college kids clung to each other, eyes wide, absorbing a lesson about power they would never forget. And in the center of it all sat the veteran, silent, steady, a phone resting on the table like a dormant weapon. The silence had already done its work. It had cracked the armor of the officers, made their bravado look brittle. But silence alone would not end this. Not tonight. The veteran's thumb hovered over the cracked screen. One number glowed on display, already dialed, already waiting. His voice came low, gravel in his throat, steady as stone. Last chance. Daniel scoffed, though the sound carried an edge of unease. Last chance for what, old man? To call for backup? To order a pizza? He laughed at his own joke, but his eyes betrayed him, darting between the phone and Blake. Blake leaned in close, face red, spit sharp at the corners of his mouth. Go ahead. Make your call. See who picks up. Nobody cares about you. The veteran didn't argue. He didn't curse. He simply tapped the screen. The ringing filled the air, each tone echoing louder than the last. The diner went still. One ring. 2. 3. Then a click. A voice answered on speakerphone, calm, authoritative, measured. General Harlow. The name alone froze Daniel's mid-smirk. Blake blinked, his mouth opening slightly. Millie dropped her rag, the sound small but sharp against the counter. The trucker muttered, "Holy hell," under his breath. The veteran leaned back in his booth, his eyes never leaving Blake's. He didn't need to raise his voice. "It's me." There was a pause on the line, followed by a shift in tone. Not cold. Not detached. But respectful. "Sergeant. I've been trying to reach you." The officers stiffened. "General. Sergeant." These weren't empty titles. These were ranks. Real ones. The veteran's voice was calm, almost casual. "Got a situation. Couple of small-town cops. Think they're bigger than the uniform." The diner held its breath. On the line, General Harlow's voice hardened. "Put me on speaker." The veteran set the phone upright on the table. The general's voice filled the diner, crisp, commanding, the kind of voice that once moved battalions and shifted the course of battles. "This is General Harlow, United States Army." Which one of you boys thinks it's wise to harass a decorated combat veteran in public? Blake's mouth opened, then closed. His face drained of color. Daniels stammered, sir, we were just. Just what? Harlow's tone cracked like thunder. Just abusing your badge. Just disrespecting a man who bled for this country while you were still polishing your cruiser. The silence that followed was suffocating. Even the clock above the counter seemed to stop ticking. Names, Harlow snapped. Blake swallowed hard. Oh, Officer Blake. Sir. And this is Officer Daniels. There was a pause, the kind that carries the weight of judgment. Then Harlow's voice dropped to a low, lethal calm. By tomorrow morning, both of your chiefs will have my report on their desks. I'll make sure your conduct tonight is reviewed by the state board. You think that badge makes you untouchable? Think again. Blake's hands twitched. Daniels's face flushed red, shame burning through arrogance. Harlow's tone softened when he addressed the veteran again. Sergeant, you sit tight. You're not alone anymore. The veteran didn't smile. He didn't nod. He simply ended the call with one press of his thumb. The silence that followed was heavier than gunfire. The two officers stood frozen, their swagger stripped away. The diner, once held hostage by their arrogance, now belonged to the quiet man in the booth. Millie broke the silence first, her voice sharp, cutting. You heard the general. Get out. The trucker added, his gravelly voice carrying weight, yeah. Time for you boys to leave. The college girl found her courage too. You should be ashamed. The ripple of voices grew, not loud, but firm, steady. For once, the town stood not behind the badge, but behind the man who had said almost nothing at all. Blake's jaw worked, fury warring with humiliation. Daniels shifted his weight, clearly wanting to bolt. But neither spoke. Neither dared. The veteran sat back, calm as ever, the phone silent on the table. He didn't gloat. He didn't taunt. He let the silence finish the work. Because power, real power, doesn't scream. It doesn't shove. It doesn't need to prove itself. Sometimes, power is one phone call. Sometimes, power is knowing exactly who will answer when the world thinks you have no one left. The cops turned for the door, their boots suddenly heavy, their shoulders no longer broad. The bell jingled weakly as they left, the red and blue lights outside flickering off into the night. Inside, the diner exhaled. Millie leaned on the counter, her chest rising and falling as though she'd just run a mile. The trucker shook his head slowly, awe in his tired eyes. The college kids whispered, voices reverent now instead of fearful. The veteran lifted his mug, finishing the last of his coffee. The silence returned, but this time, it was different. Not heavy. Not tense. It was the silence of peace, if only for a moment. He set the mug down gently. Then, without a word, he slid out of the booth, his coat brushing against the vinyl. He left a few crumpled bills on the table, more than enough to cover the meal, though no one would have asked him for a dime. As he reached the door, Millie called after him. Thank you. He didn't turn. Didn't answer. Just stepped into the night, where the neon flicker met the darkness, and walked on with the quiet dignity of a man who needed no applause. Because his silence had spoken louder than their power ever could. The diner had returned to its rhythm, the soft hum of the fridge, the low flicker of neon outside, the quiet clink of cutlery on porcelain. But nothing felt the same. The moment the door closed behind the officers, something had shifted. For years, Blake and Daniels had walked into places like this with the same swagger. They were used to silence, the silence of compliance, of fear, of people who looked the other way to avoid becoming the next target. But tonight, that silence had turned against them. And worse, someone with real power had heard it. The veteran's phone call lingered in the air even after he'd left. General Harlow's voice still echoed in the minds of everyone in the diner. The trucker muttered to Millie, "Never seen them shut up so fast. Damn near tripped over themselves." The college kids whispered excitedly, their fear replaced by awe. Millie simply stood behind the counter, staring at the door, knowing deep down she had just witnessed the kind of justice her town rarely saw. Outside, Blake and Daniels stormed toward their cruiser. "You believe that crap?" Daniels hissed, his face still red. "General? Sergeant? He's bluffing." "Had to be." Blake yanked the door open, his jaw clenched so tight the muscle jumped. "That wasn't bluffing, Dan. You heard the way he talked to him. That was real." Daniels slid into the passenger seat, his bravado cracking. "So what, some washed-up old soldiers got friends in high places. Big deal. What's he gonna do?" Blake didn't answer. He stared through the windshield, the red and blue of their own lights bouncing off the diner's glass. For the first time in a long time, he felt small in his uniform. Back inside, the veteran's absence left a strange calm. Millie picked up his plate, wiped down the booth, but her mind replayed every detail. The way he had sat still while chaos tried to swallow him. The way he said almost nothing, yet commanded the room. The way one call had stripped two arrogant men of all their power. "He'll be fine," she muttered to herself, though a part of her wondered. Men like him never stayed in one place long. But the ripple had already begun. By morning, the story had spread. The trucker told it at his next stop, embellishing the general's voice until it sounded like a thunderclap over the CB radio. The college kids posted fragments online, shaky retellings about a homeless veteran who put two cops in their place with a single phone call. Millie told her sister over the phone, her words trembling with pride and disbelief. And within hours, the rumor reached the precinct. Captain Reynolds sat behind his desk, staring at his two officers. Blake and Daniels shifted under his gaze, uniforms suddenly heavy on their backs. "You harassed a veteran?" Reynolds asked, voice flat. "A decorated sergeant." Blake opened his mouth. "Sir, we didn't know." Reynolds slammed his fist on the desk, rattling pens and paper. "You didn't need to know. You're supposed to treat every citizen with respect, whether he's a general or a janitor. And now? Now I've got a 4-star general breathing down my neck, demanding answers." Daniel swallowed hard. He really was who he said he was. Reynolds leaned forward, eyes like steel. "You better believe it. And thanks to you two clowns, the state's Internal Affairs Division is already sniffing around. They want your names. They want your reports. And if even half of what I've heard checks out, you're both finished." The power had shifted. For years, Blake and Daniels had been untouchable, their arrogance fed by a system that looked the other way. But tonight, their careers hung by a thread. A man they had dismissed as a nobody had pulled that thread with nothing but silence and a single phone call. That night, Millie locked up the diner later than usual. She stood outside under the neon glow, her breath misting in the cool air. She thought about the veteran, the way he had walked out without a word, leaving dignity in his wake. She Hoped he had found a safe place to sleep. She hoped, wherever he was, he knew he had changed something. Because the town felt different now. The people who had been silent witnesses, the trucker, the kids, even Millie herself, carried a new kind of memory. A reminder that not all power comes from a badge or a gun. Sometimes, it comes from a man who refuses to bend. Sometimes, it comes from a phone call that reminds the world who you really are. And sometimes, that's enough to topple the mighty. Blake and Daniels didn't swagger anymore. Their names, once spoken with either fear or indifference, were now whispered with disdain. Their shadows had shrunk. Their power was cracked. The veteran had walked out into the night, coat pulled tight, boots heavy from miles of wandering. He hadn't looked back. He didn't need to. His silence had already done the work. His call had already shifted the ground beneath men who thought they owned it. The storm wasn't over. But the winds had changed. And for the first time in a long time, justice didn't feel like a stranger. Morning broke cold and gray over the small town. The diner's neon lights had long since gone dark, but whispers from the night before were still alive, carried from one mouth to another like embers refusing to die out. By sunrise, those whispers had caught fire. The veteran's story, the silence, the phone call, the shift in power, had spread across the town and beyond. Truckers relayed it on highways. College students tweeted it with grainy photos of the confrontation. Millie's sister told her coworkers, and they told theirs. Soon the tale of two cops humbled by a homeless black veteran was no longer rumor, it was a storm gathering momentum. Inside the precinct, that storm had already reached full force. Blake and Daniel sat stiff-backed in the captain's office, their eyes darting anywhere but at Captain Reynolds. The desk between them felt more like a courtroom bench. On it sat two thick files, both stamped with internal affairs in bold letters. Reynolds leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. He was a man who had weathered many scandals in his years, but the weight of this one pressed heavier than most. His voice was gravel when he finally spoke. "You boys understand the mess you've landed us in?" Neither answered. Two decorated veterans called my office before I even poured my first cup of coffee. One of them was General Harlow himself. He doesn't make social calls. He made a demand. Reynolds leaned forward, his eyes sharp. He wants you both off the streets. Effective immediately. Daniels shifted in his chair, his throat bobbing. "Sir, we didn't know who he was. We thought." "You thought what?" Reynolds cut him off. "That a man's worth depends on whether you recognize his face. That harassment's fine unless your victim's got friends in high places." The silence that followed was suffocating. Reynolds slid the files toward them. "Internal Affairs is investigating. Civil rights groups are calling for your badges. And the mayor? He wants your heads on a platter before the next election cycle." Blake's jaw tightened. He wanted to argue, to remind the captain how many years he'd served, how many corners he'd cut for the department's convenience, how many times he'd looked the other way when orders weren't exactly clean. But the words caught in his throat. For the first time in his career, he realized nobody was coming to shield him. The reckoning had arrived. By noon, the suspension orders were official. Their badges were taken, their service weapons locked away. Officers who once laughed at their crude jokes now avoided their eyes. The power that had cloaked them like armor was gone, stripped clean in a matter of hours. The news spread fast. Local reporters caught wind, then state outlets picked it up. Headlines ran with phrases like, "Homeless veteran humiliates police," and "One phone call ends careers." By evening, the story had gone national. The image of two swaggering cops being undone by their own arrogance became a symbol, one more chapter in a long history of justice delayed but not denied. Meanwhile, the veteran remained a ghost. No one knew where he had gone. Some said he'd boarded a bus out of town. Others swore they'd seen him walking the back roads at dusk, shoulders square despite the weight of his duffel bag. He didn't linger for applause. He didn't wait for vindication. He had made his point and moved on. But his absence only deepened the impact. At the diner, Millie found herself replaying every moment. When reporters stopped by, she gave careful, measured words. He wasn't loud. He wasn't violent. He didn't need to be. His silence was enough to show what kind of man he was. The college kids returned too, this time not to whisper in fear but to sit proudly in the booth where he had once sat. They told anyone who would listen how they had seen the shift firsthand, how power had drained from two armed men and gathered instead in the quiet resolve of someone the world had discarded. Even the trucker, hardened by decades on the road, felt compelled to share the tale at every stop. "Saw it with my own eyes," he'd say, slapping the counter. Two uniforms shaking like leaves, all 'cause one man made a phone call. You tell me that ain't justice. But justice wasn't just the loss of power. For Blake and Daniels, the reckoning carried deeper scars. Lawsuits began to surface. Old complaints once buried in paperwork were dug up, re-examined under fresh light. Former victims came forward, their voices steadier now that the officers' shields were gone. The system that had long protected them had turned on them, piece by piece. Blake found himself in a lawyer's office, facing allegations he had thought would never resurface. Daniels, once cocky and loud, now spent nights staring at the ceiling, his phone buzzing with threats and condemnation. Their lives, once anchored by authority, were adrift. It wasn't just a fall from grace. It was exposure, the unmasking of men who had built their power on fear, only to watch it crumble in the face of dignity. And though the veteran never reappeared, his shadow loomed over it all. Somewhere, on a cold park bench or in a dim shelter, he was likely just another man blending into the edges of society. But to the people of that town, he had become something more. A reminder that silence could roar louder than violence, that one phone call could topple giants, that dignity could outlast corruption. The reckoning was not loud. It wasn't a dramatic trial or a Hollywood showdown. It was slower, sharper, a steady unraveling that left two men hollow and a town forever changed. For Blake and Daniels, it was the end of their careers. For the community, it was a story they would tell for years. And for the veteran, wherever he was, it was just another chapter in a life already written. With scars. The balance of power had shifted. The reckoning had come. And the world, for once, had chosen the side of justice. The town was never the same after that night at the diner. Not because of riots or protests, not because of headlines alone, but because something had shifted in the quiet corners of ordinary lives. The memory of that veteran, sitting with calm resolve while two armed men tried to strip him of dignity, had etched itself into the town's conscience. His silence, his patience, and finally his single phone call, it all became legend. Millie noticed it first in small ways. 1 week after the incident, she saw a group of high school kids teasing a frail old man outside the diner. Normally, folks would have looked away, chalking it up to kids being kids. But not this time. The trucker who had witnessed everything that night stepped in, his voice sharp as gravel, show some respect. You don't know who you're talking to. The kids scattered. The old man, bewildered, tipped his hat and shuffled away. The trucker came inside for coffee after, and when Millie refilled his cup, he said, "It ain't about who he is, Millie. It's about who he could be. Learn that from your quiet customer." She smiled softly, realizing the lesson had already begun to ripple outward. At the precinct, Blake and Daniel's absence was like a wound that wouldn't heal. Their lockers had been emptied, their names scrubbed from the roster. Younger officers whispered about them with a mix of disdain and warning. The message was clear, the badge was not invincible. Authority, once abused, could vanish in an instant. The general's call hadn't just cost them their jobs, it had rewritten the culture of the department. For once, oversight committees visited not as a formality, but with genuine scrutiny. Training officers reminded recruits of the diner story, framing it as a cautionary tale. Respect the people you serve, they warned, because you never know whose dignity you're trampling. The reckoning had passed, but its shadow lingered, shaping the future. As for the veteran himself, his presence remained a mystery. Some swore they saw him boarding a Greyhound bus heading south, his duffel bag heavy on his shoulder. Others claimed he was sleeping under the overpass near the truck stop, blending into the background as he always had. There were even rumors he'd been offered housing by a veterans nonprofit, though no one could confirm it. But in truth, it didn't matter. His story had outgrown his physical presence. He had become more than a man in that booth. He was now a symbol of resilience, of quiet power, of a truth too long ignored. Millie often found herself looking at that booth late at night when business slowed. She'd picture him sitting there, coat frayed but posture strong, eyes steady as the storm built around him. She had seen countless men come through her diner, but none had left an imprint like him. He didn't need to yell, she told a reporter once. Didn't need to fight. He just sat there, calm as stone. And somehow, that was louder than anything else in the room. The reporter asked if she thought the man would ever return. Millie only smiled, wiping down the counter. Men like him don't come back. They move forward. Always forward. Meanwhile, Blake and Daniels faced their new reality. The lawsuits stacked higher. Old misconduct buried in shadows now clawed into daylight. For years they had been wolves in uniforms, but now the world saw them as disgraced men hiding from the weight of their own actions. And perhaps that was the truest punishment of all, not prison bars, but the slow erosion of pride. The silence of phones that no longer rang with opportunities. The averted eyes of neighbors who once envied their swagger. The bitter taste of a legacy destroyed. Dignity, they learned too late, is a fragile thing. Once stripped, it rarely returns. For the veteran, dignity had never been given freely by society. It had been earned in battlefields far away, in sleepless nights under open skies, in the quiet endurance of a life that had given him scars instead of rewards. Yet when two men tried to take that from him in a diner, he had shown the world something undeniable. They could not take what he refused to surrender. His silence had been his shield. His phone call, his sword. And with both, he had reclaimed something greater than respect, he had restored his place in the story. Months later, Millie found herself walking to the war memorial in the center of town. It was early morning, the square empty, the air crisp. She carried a small bouquet of wildflowers. She wasn't sure why, maybe it was because she couldn't stop thinking of him. She laid the flowers at the foot of the monument, her eyes tracing the engraved names of soldiers long gone. And for a moment, she imagined his name among them, though he was still alive somewhere. She whispered softly, almost to herself, "Thank you." Not just for the service she knew he had given in uniform, but for the service he had given without one, reminding her town that justice isn't always loud, and dignity doesn't need a uniform to be real. That night, the diner filled again. Truckers swapped stories. Students tapped at laptops. Regulars ate in their booths. And though the veteran never returned, his presence lingered in every clink of silverware, every hush that fell when the door opened, every act of kindness that seemed just a little more deliberate now. The town had been given a gift, not of spectacle, but of perspective. And in the end, that was the truest kind of dignity, not just the respect one claims for themselves, but the respect that inspires others to live differently. The veteran had walked away into the night, leaving no forwarding address, no thanks, no closure. He didn't need any of it. His lesson had been delivered, his silence louder than sirens, his phone call more powerful than handcuffs. The cops had lost everything. The town had gained something priceless. And the man who carried his scars beneath a worn coat had moved on, his dignity intact, restored not by the world, but by himself. For sometimes, dignity is not what people give you. It is what you refuse to let them take away.